Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're popping the hood to run a top-level system diagnostic on the anatomy of a business. We're going to break down the true nature of costs, production, and exactly how a firm decides its path to success, turning abstract economic theory into clear, actionable insights.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think of this as our system boot-up sequence. First, redefining profit and cost. Then, the production function. Third, the anatomy of short-run costs. And finally, scaling up into the long run.
Section 1. Redefining profit and cost.
So before we even look at the factory floor, we've got to understand how different professionals actually analyze a firm's success. It's kind of fascinating. There's this huge contrast between the accountant and the economist. Now, accountants, their job is tracking the money physically flowing in and out of the firm, right? They measure explicit costs, the actual cash leaving your wallet. So accounting profit is just total revenue minus those explicit costs. Boom, simple. But economists, they take a much broader view. They want to know how firms make actual production and pricing decisions. To them, it's not just about what's in the cash register, it's about opportunity. Economic profit subtracts not just the explicit costs, but all the implicit costs from that total revenue.
Right, so understanding these implicit costs is absolutely crucial. These are the opportunity cost of production that don't involve a direct outflow of money. And honestly, ignoring them, it can give you this really dangerous false sense of success. Let's imagine a farmer. Their accountant finishes the books and happily reports an $80,000 accounting profit for the year. Sounds amazing on paper, right? But then our economist steps in and points out the implicit costs. Like, hey, what about the salary the farmer gave up by not working a corporate job? Or the interest lost on the cash tied up in farming equipment? When you factor those in, that $80,000 profit might actually represent an economic zero-profit equilibrium. The farmer's surviving, sure, but they aren't actually getting ahead of their opportunity costs.
Section 2. The production function.
All right, now that we've got our financial metrics dialed in, let's zoom in from the macro level straight down to the factory floor. And this brilliantly illustrates the physical reality of production constraints. Just think about historical archival files showing those incredibly crowded street markets. When you try to cram too much input, like way too many people and vendors, into a fixed amount of space, your efficiency completely plummets. It's the exact same in a business setting. As you keep adding workers to a fixed workspace, eventually those workers just start getting in each other's way. Equipment has to be shared, things get cramped, and honestly, the sheer chaos of it all just slows everyone down. Which brings us to an inevitable, rock-solid law of production, diminishing marginal product. It's basically the property where the marginal product of an input actually declines as you increase the quantity of that input. Think of an apple orchard. You hire your first couple of workers and they go straight for the low-hanging fruit, right? Their output is massive. But as you hire more and more people, all those easy apples are gone. The new workers have to drag out ladders, climb higher, spend more time searching. So each brand new worker actually contributes less to your total production than the person you hired right before them. We can actually map this out perfectly using the numbers from, let's say, Caroline's Cookie Factory. When Caroline hires her first worker, they crank out a solid baseline of cookies. She hires a second worker, they still have plenty of room, and boom, that second worker adds a whopping 40 cookies to the total production. But watch what happens as that factory floor gets crowded. By the time she hires her fourth worker, that new addition only brings 20 extra cookies to the table. The marginal product is literally diminishing right before our eyes, causing the whole production function to just flatten out. Section 3. Anatomy of short-run costs. So having diagnosed the factory floor, we need to translate that physical production data into actionable short-run cost metrics. To really grasp a firm's bottom line, we've got to break total cost down into its component parts. First up, fixed costs. These are the underlying baseline costs that do not change, no matter how much you produce. For Caroline, it costs $30 an hour just to keep the lights on and pay the rent. Then you have variable costs. These are the ones that shift directly with your production quantity, like the $10 an hour she pays per worker. Now, if we divide those totals by the quantity of output, we get our average total cost. And finally, the big one, marginal cost. This is simply the increase in total cost that arises from producing just one extra unit. Now, what's really interesting about this is how these metrics take shape when you track them. Think about that marginal cost metric. Because of the diminishing marginal product we just talked about, because every new worker produces a little less, it costs more and more to squeeze out that next unit of output. This literally forces your marginal cost upward. And as it pushes upward, it intersects the average total cost exactly at its lowest point. That classic U shape of the average total cost, it's basically a tug of war.
You've got high fixed costs spreading out over early production, pulling it down, but then skyrocketing marginal costs take over as the factory gets overcrowded, pulling it right back up. All right, so we've mapped out the short-run constraints. Let's pause for a quick narrative question. How long does it actually take a firm to get to the long run? Well, there's no single answer. It depends entirely on the size and scope of the business. I mean, a local coffee shop, they can hit the long run in a matter of days. They just go out and buy another espresso machine. But a massive operation like the Ford Motor Company, it literally takes years for them to scout land, design, and build an entirely new, larger factory.
Section 4. Scaling up. The long run. Let's move to the horizon scan and see how this builds a completely new landscape for the business. We are now in an environment where all those fixed costs finally become variable. Businesses are no longer trapped by their current factory walls. Over time, you'll see different short-run factory sizes, small, medium, large, acting as temporary constraints. But in the long run, the firm actually gets to choose which of those factory sizes it wants to build. So the long-run average total cost acts as this wide boundary beneath all those short-run constraints. It essentially charts the ultimate scaling potential of the business over time. Now, as a firm scales up efficiently, they experience economies of scale. This just means their long-run average total cost is actually falling as they pump out more output. But why does this happen? Well, it often comes down to intense worker specialization. Think back to a modern assembly line at Ford. When you're making cars on a massive scale, you don't have one person building an entire car from scratch. You have highly specialized workers mastering one very specific task with incredible efficiency. And that drives the overall average cost per car way, way down. But, and this is a big but, there is absolutely a limit to this optimization. If a firm scales up a bit too much, they begin to experience diseconomies of scale. This is where the long-run average total cost starts rising as output increases. It's an inevitable friction, usually caused by serious coordination problems within a massive, stretched-too-thin management team. An organization can just get so huge and bureaucratic that communication totally breaks down, managers lose control of costs, and the sheer physical weight of the company makes it inefficient. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and I want to leave you with a classic adage, jack of all trades, master of none. This really hits the nail on the head regarding the nature of cost curves and specialization. Try to do absolutely everything in a tiny, cramped factory and your costs will skyrocket. If you specialize and scale wisely, you become a master of efficiency. But scale too far and you lose all coordination and control. So as we wrap up, I want you to think about your own work environment or business. Are you suffering from crowded constraints and diminishing returns, or are you actually scaling into true economies of scale? Understanding your own production function is the very first step to mastering it.